Hi, and welcome back to my class on the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of Dr. John D. If you've been following along with me, you know that we're up to Theorem 12 by now. So I'm glad you're here. Let me share my screen and we will just get started. You know by now that D is living in a kind of echo chamber of numbers. So since this is 12 signs of the zodiac, 12 months of the year, you probably figure it has something to do with time, and indeed it does. We're going to look this class mainly at the planetary and some zodiacal signs, and then start into the notion of time itself as alchemy, although that will continue on more in the next video. You know the drill here. I'm assuming you know who John D is, what the Monas Hieroglyphica is. You've seen the previous videos. We went all through the letter to Maximillian, the first 11 theorems. Please watch those videos first. If you haven't seen them, I'd love to have you join me, but this is probably not the place to jump in. I've got a link to that playlist below. We are looking at this in terms of these implied cosmogenic texts, or texts that help give us a construct for the creation of the universe, whether it is the Pythagorean cosmogenesis, that's the Timaeus, biblical Genesis, the Sefer Yetzirah. So we went through the first 10 theorems where he is setting up the structure of that, and now time has begun. All I'm really going to do is, in terms of review here, is go over some basic ideas. Theorem 11, we looked at the mystical sign of Aries. If you watch my pointer here, you'll see I'm pointing to it in the monad glyph. It's that thing there at the bottom, formed of two half circles connected by a common point. There's the common point. And he says it stands at the place of basically the spring equinox, where days and nights are equal, hence these two overlapping circles. Remember that the year in D's time started at the spring equinox, not January 1st, like we do it now. And 24 theorems, 24 hours in a day divided by 2, oh, that 12, that gets us here now. But one of the things we talked about was even as time is starting, he's looking back to this world of being, the world of perfect eternal forms that don't change, to make sense of what in the Timaeus is called the world of becoming, where everything changes. You don't know even what elements are mixed with whatever else. You can't step into the same river twice. So it's interesting that even as time is beginning, this shape of the vesica is part of one of the actually the first proposition in Euclid's Elements, which D famously wrote the introduction to the first English translation of only 3 years after the Hieroglyphic Monad. So we talked about different symbols associated with the vesica. We also talked about this in terms of how it can also refer to the non-Sephira dot. I've, between then and now, given you another bit of supplementary material on John Dee's use of Kabbalah. But I want to just point out a few things about the kind of shapes D is drawing. Notice that Aries, for example, again, that little thing at the bottom of the monad there, that's a sign of Aries, first sign of the zodiac. And he talks about the first 12th of the first sign of 12th, the dodecameria of Aries. It's in effect made of 2 sun signs, and there are theorems in Euclid about how to make a shape like this also, because the whole idea, now here's how to make the vesica, here's how you'd make that shape of Aries, right? And instead of getting what in geometry class would be called, well, here's a 60-60-60, an equilateral triangle divided in half, and you have a 30-60-91, and you have that triangle shape that in the Timaeus is the same in air, water, fire, and allows them to switch, but doesn't match earth, so you have to mix earth with things. Okay, well, over here you have a 45-45-90 triangle, and you can apply your favorite theorem from grade school or high school, the Pythagorean theorem, to both of them. Anyway, you get that shape. I want to just remind you why in D's world you would be doing this. You contemplate, in whether you're a Platonist or a Neoplatonist, perfect Platonic forms in a fallen world as a sacred act. That is doing ancient geometry the ancient Greek way, and it's sacred geometry, because doing a proof of a perfect form like this one, the vesica, or this one, two circles intersecting at a point, is a way of having a vision into this hidden, invisible, eternal world, and a way of restoring the good, the bonitatis, in a fallen world. Contemplating perfect forms becomes a way of restoring that eternal world of being. So in, say, Dee's other, well, technical term, theorem-like book, the Propoidomata Aphoristica, where there's 120 aphorisms, he does this a lot, particularly when he's talking about conic sections, but he'll draw it there right out of Euclid too. So say you have over here a circle with half the diameter of the other, or you have a circle inside the circle like that, or you draw lines that are intersecting each of the circles at one point, which will be a model he has for conic sections. The section's 2D, but the cone itself would be 3D. So there's always the suggestion to flip a form into 3 dimensions. And we will look at later how I believe he accidentally stumbles into how to flip one into 4 dimensions, though there's no real concept of that in his time. There would be more a concept of divine revelation. If you are doing these kind of drawings or did them today, you would use integers to do it. But remember, 1 unit, and these proofs above that you see down below with numbers, both are using the number 1 unit. A monas in Greek, or a monas in Latin. Monad is what we say with that word when we're talking about the creation of a whole cosmos, but it also can just be 1 unit. All right, with all that in mind, in Theorem 12, we're expecting things about time, and he's equating time measures to spatial measures. The easiest of those, of course, a circle of 360 degrees, but in the fallen world, it's going to be a bit off, so 365 days in a year. 12 signs of the zodiac. Remember how he has stressed the ternary and quaternary repeatedly through the first 10 theorems. So 3 times 4, 12. Also, if you remember, with 6, you have a cube that you unfold and get 6 squares, and you get your hidden octad there. And that, so 6 times 2 is 12. It seems most of his favorite spatial measurements are in 12, which is associated also with the temporal measurement, unlike some numbers like 7, which you don't really see in spatial, you don't see, frankly, in spatial measurements of Platonic solids. So let's just go through a couple of these as examples. Remember, we have the tetrahedron, so 4 triangles, ternary and quaternary again, associated with fire. 3 of them meet at a vertex. You have 4 faces, 4 vertices, 6 edges. All of those are numbers you can associate with 12 or divide into 12. A cube or a hexahedron, you have 3 squares in each vertex, 6 faces, 8 vertices. That's the hidden octad, if you remember from that theorem. 12 edges. And I'll leave you to do the icosahedron and octahedron on your own, the octahedron being a dual of the cube. But it's these kind of games that are sacred games that he has been playing and has asked you to visualize. You also, by the time you get to the most perfect form of the regular Platonic solids, the true perfect form in the Timaeus is a sphere. They're all spheres that are revolving. And the dodecahedron associated with ether is thought to be the most perfect because it most looks like a sphere. That's the only place you get a number 5. It has 12 pentagonal faces. Pentagon has 4 lines make a pentagon. So he emphasizes this idea of dodecahedron often. We saw with Aries his dodecamoria of Aries, but in the letter to Maximillian, we saw when there was no reason to use a word with the root dodeca, he'd use it anyway, to kind of keep reminding you, okay, this is a perfect form. Now, 7s, and Dee is kind of obsessed with 7s, seem to be used exclusively in time measurements. 7 days of the week, also the 7 classical planets, which, as you remember from the Timaeus, in the world of being, then that image is received by this receptacle that, scholars have debated for 2,000 years what the receptacle is, but it receives images, we know that, and then the world of becoming starts. And the 7 planets gods and goddesses are there to restore order from the chaos. Five's the only you do get in spatial measures, but mainly with the, well, only with the dodecahedron. Okay, one other quick digression I want to go on is, if you remember Dee's letter to the printer, Dee talked about how, don't change any way I have written these things. And I want to give you an example that happened to me in translating this of what happens if you don't follow those instructions. And I will first tell you these two graphics that you see, one white, one brown. They're the same graphic from two different editions, the two done in Dee's lifetime, the original Antwerp one and one in Frankfurt. These ones we know were printed by printers who understood the hieroglyphic monad. And with the Antwerp one, I mean, we have the letter to the printer basically so other people can read it. Dee was living with William Sylvius when it was printed, so he could have just told this to Sylvius, but he wants it out there for other people to know. Don't change anything that I do here. Now, I found in this first one, this was one of only 4 places that I saw a difference between the Antwerp edition and the Frankfurt edition, and it looks pretty small. I'll tell you what the others were first. All right, one of them I've already mentioned. It was the upside down monad glyph. I talked about that in Theorem 10. For some reason, you get to the end of the Frankfurt edition and suddenly there's an upside down monad, a clear cue that, hey, somewhere in here you need to flip this thing upside down. And that cue helped a lot in understanding what he was doing in those first 10 theorems. The second one isn't one that I discovered. It was actually David Oveson, which is the pen name of the late art historian Fred Gettings. And what David Oveson found was, well, the Frankfurt edition is smaller. I mean, that was obvious, but there seems to be a significance between the number of lines in the Frankfurt edition. Why? Because unless there is a graphic or something that greatly shortens the number of lines, what you have are 22 lines a page. Yes, like 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, the 22 letters that in the Sefer Yetzirah create the world. Lest anyone, think that folks didn't know much about Hebrew, then they were Christian Kabbalists. We're going to talk more about their Christian Kabbalah here. All right, so those are the first two. The third is in a later theorem. It's this box that's filled in one and not the other. And the fourth is here. If you look at this white version here, you see a symbol of Mercury in the the fourth column over. Fourth column over here, it's moved up some. Now, if I were working with anyone or translating anyone but John Dee, I would say, well, this is just a printer error. In fact, people have made some fairly big mistakes in talking about printer errors with Dee, but so I'd fix it. In fact, in the early translation of this work that Dr. Turner and I had published in the Journal of the Western Mystery Tradition, we had a graphic which I'll show you in a minute, that didn't look anything much like this. And that was a big mistake on our part, because if you start fixing things without understanding them, you can just not know what's going on. For example, since you're interested in the hieroglyphic monad and you're watching this, you probably already know the signs of the planet. You probably can just draw a sign of Mars. So maybe you look at either of these and you notice the sign of Mars there looks a little wonky. That's not how we do it. Let's fix it. Okay, and if you do that, it just shows you haven't understood the theorem. All right, let me read through the theorem, then I'm going to go on to the next page. I'll show you the graphic we had in our first translation that was a poor choice and tell you why. And then we will look at his instructions for how to draw the planets and why. He says the most ancient wise ones, the Magi, have passed down to us the hieroglyphic signs of the 5 planets. Oh, aren't there usually 7? Yes, but if you read through here, you'll find out why he's referring to only 5 planets, all of which have been composed out of the characteristics for the moon and sun. Oh, that's it. The moon and sun, the 2 luminaries, are not counted in that 5. So you have the moon and the sun, and the other 5, that's 7. That's your usual classical number of planets. And yes, we know that today we call the moon a moon, not a planet. And we add in with planets Earth, but we're using the classical 7 planets, and what he's done is taken out the luminaries. Okay, composed out of the characteristics for the moon and sun, along with the elements or the hieroglyphic sign of Aries. That's those semicircles joined at a point that I just talked about. You see their figures here, and he shows them to you. He continues and says, it will not be difficult to explain each of these hieroglyphs from our previously established foundations. But first, let us now discuss paraphrastically those that have the imprint of the moon, and thereafter those of the sun. Throughout the science of the elements, our lunar nature, when once revolved around the earth, is mystically called Saturn. You've got that right. Our lunar nature, when once revolved around the earth, is mystically called Saturn. If you're a Kabbalist, you can just pause the video here and see if you can figure out what he means by that. And for the same reason, it also had the name of Jupiter and retained a form set apart. And they designated the moon the third time a primary substance was brought forth from the 4 elements with a more obscure mark, one they were accustomed to calling Mercury. Oh, so is he equating these with this primary substance? Remember, we've discussed is in Latin elementata, and what it is the first mixture of one of the 4 elements. So you mix fire and water, and you would have an elementata that is like water of fire or fire of water, depending how much you would have of one or the other. So is he saying that these 5 planets themselves are elementatas, primary substances? So one they were accustomed to calling Mercury, and he says, you see how lunar Mercury is. And in the margin over here, we get a drawing of Mercury that looks nothing like the way we draw a Mercury now or did then, and it matches the one he had up in these drawings. And one supposes it looks lunar because of this crescent, which is in his monad glyph is his sign for the moon. Some wise ones wish that it be permitted for this to be produced by the 4th revolution. First, with the hint with these revolutions, now we know from the Timaeus everything is revolving, but what is revolving? And if it's the whole cosmos, then we're talking about major world ages. That, he says, will not at least be contrary to our secret proposition. Oh, what is that? So long as the purest magical spirit will superintend the work of the whitening in the place of the moon, and by means of spiritual virtue itself, it may, without words, speak hieroglyphically, alone with us, through nearly the middle of the natural day, and introducing and imprinting into the most pure and simple earth that which we have prepared, those 4 geogamic figures, or in their stead, that other figure. And then you get a drawing of these at the bottom. These 4 geogamic figures and this other figure. Okay, so by the way, in 2007, this was the graphic I had above. My editor kindly offered to do the graphics and said, does this look okay? And I said, yeah, it looks great. But the lines that we had in didn't go there. In other words, I was defying Dee's letter to the printer, and we changed just a little thing. And then it makes, as you'll see by the next video, it makes this theorem. You can't make sense of it. And my goal here is to explain each of the theorems. Okay, the hieroglyphic sign of the planets. Here is Jupiter. His Jupiter, and I'm pointing at it with my cursor now, looks similar to the way we draw Jupiter, but not exactly the same. Saturn looks a little bit like we draw Saturn, but it's not the same. And what is this flipped Jupiter underneath here that really looks like it's just Saturn flipped over? And Mercury doesn't look like the way we draw Mercury. And there seem to be 2 Mercuries. Now, the first thing one would think, since he's using the language of physical alchemy in this theorem, is that one of them is sort of regular Mercury and one of them is philosophic Mercury. What you get philosophic Mercury with the philosopher's stone, according to people who write about physical alchemy. So then why do we have two symbols of Mercury, just to be clear. We also would think about who the ancient wise ones are. Maybe they're the three wise men of the Bible. They could be, since he has multiple references for many things. But more obviously, they're the Greek philosophers and geometers whose work Dee has been driving upon, particularly Euclid and Timaeus as portrayed by Plato, but not only them. And what characteristics they have, we've already talked about. They're contemplating perfect form as a way of restoring the perfect good from that eternal world of being into the world of becoming. Now you need some images perhaps to capture that, and that will lead us here to magical seals in a moment. But you see what Dee is doing here. He's contemplated the forms of the signs, and he's restoring them to what he thinks they should look like and why. We don't have any record of any ancient wise ones passing down forms like this that look the way that Dee has written them. Although, by the way he does the forms, you can make all of them with a compass and straight edge, which, as we've noted, is important. But what I want you to notice is he's doing a kind of parallel activity of what the Kabbalists do. You know, there is not in the Bible any ancient tree of life. In fact, different people tried to draw it out in different ways. What rabbinic Kabbalists did was seek revelation, not Christian revelation, obviously, but direct communion with that language as a sacred language. And after a lot of reflection, sometimes fix things that seem like maybe they deteriorated a bit but could be revived. And they do that by contemplating the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the Kabbalah names associated with the tree of life. We also talked about how that angel magic, the kind that Dee becomes famous for with his Enochian book, is associated with a similar kind of revelatory activity, because you then associate with the tree of life all the way up different names of archangels, angels, choirs of angels, and you're, in pondering them, asking for a kind of direct revelation. Or at least that is one approach to what you're doing. And that's maybe cleaning up the mess that magic had become in the Middle Ages, where you just get circles that people didn't know what the markings on meant anymore, and you're trying to bind demons and that kind of thing. Christian Kabbalists, as we've talked about in several earlier videos, appropriate this tradition. They don't do it randomly, but they certainly appropriate it, and they have either the insight or the temerity, and I'd say temerity is closer to it, to think, oh, we're going to add to this. So the tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, becomes the pentagrammaton, Yod He Shin Vav He, and all of the things that Jewish Kabbalists, rabbinic Kabbalists have been pondering start coming in with Pico de Mirandola, with Johann Reuchlin. We've talked about all of that, and you have converso Jews like Riccio, who is translating 12th century works of Abraham ben Joseph Gikatia, and that system coming in and being one that certainly Dee is drawing upon. Why do I say certainly? Because the monad fits it perfectly. Okay, and then you see an explicit outpicturing of it later in the work of Athanasius Kircher. Okay, so then you have the common Renaissance habit of the Old Testament prefiguring the New, so that gets brought into Kabbalah also. Adam prefigures Christ, gets associated with Tifereth, and so forth. I've got some links to some of those earlier videos below and supplementary material if you missed it. The 5 classical planets, as I've mentioned, are 5 because we've taken out the luminaries, and the luminaries are made of the rest of them. Now, there will be some important reasons for that. See if you can guess at what some of them are before I get to them and say them. So let's go on to this next paragraph. He says, it won't be difficult to explain each of these hieroglyphs from our previously established foundations. Well, we're using the luminaries because the sun and the moon are the luminaries that from Earth their light is always affecting Earth, right? You see the sun every day, and even if you don't see it because of clouds, unless there is a total eclipse, it's still light out. And even in a total solar eclipse, it doesn't get totally black. Similarly, at night, you always get the reflected light of the moon. So that's our previously established foundations. Light is what has created everything. And so the two luminaries, sun and moon, from the shapes of those and Aries, the beginning of time, you get the rest of the forms. Now, what does this word paraphrastically mean? It can mean a paraphrase, but it isn't a paraphrase the way we think of it as like an aside or parenthetically. What it is and I'm sorry to talk about the thrilling topic of Latin grammar. It's what in Latin, it is the passive periphrastic construction. And that doesn't exactly translate into English, which is why I'm telling you about it now. If you studied the classics or if you studied Latin, you may know this famous statement made by Cato, Carthago delinda est, which is usually translated as Carthage must be destroyed. Okay, why is it must when there is no must in the Latin? Because it's this passive periphrastic construction, which has the sense of must or something that is really important and inevitable. Carthage has to be destroyed. So Dee is using that in talking about these to give an idea of, well, there's a kind of inevitability that these would be the perfect forms of these planets. That's what he is saying. Now, if we continue on, first, let us now discuss paraphrastically those that have the imprint of the moon. That is these first three columns that you see. The other side, the second three columns, will be associated with the sun. That will be Theorem 13. So we're just going to discuss the first three columns with this theorem. Through the science of the elements, our lunar nature, when once revolved around the Earth, is mystically called Saturn. Why does the moon become Saturn? If you're an astrologer, you might say, oh, because Saturn is the higher octave of the moon. Okay, that's possible. Also, notice it says our lunar nature. So it's our humans' lunar nature. And you may remember in the previous theorem, when we flipped the monad, we knew to do it because the moon is looking up at the sun rather than being as in the right side up glyph on top of the sun. And receiving sun's rays, which we associated with Yesod receiving the energy from Tiferet. All right. All of these could be reasons why the moon becomes Saturn. So Kabbalists out there perhaps have already filled in the rest of the blank that in terms of Kabbalah and the correspondences Dee has in Theorem 10, including quite a few that I didn't even say in that video because I didn't want it to go on for hours. Dee is assuming that you know these correspondences, which you later see pictured out in Kircher, but exist back in Reuchlin and so forth. Yesod is associated with the moon, and it's a reflection of the sphere of Saturn, Bina, the second Sephira. It's sometimes also referred to the path from Yesod to Malkuth, that is the path of manifestation, or the moon acting through Saturn upon the four elements. It can be any of those things. So those are the associations that we look for between a lunar nature of Yesod and mystical Saturn. All right. Now, I'm going to assume here that you've noticed something strange about Mercury because, as I've mentioned, there's more than one of them. And this first one, that is the first column that I'm pointing to now, doesn't look anything like our Mercury. He's also got it out to the same one out to the side here, the side of that second paragraph. I've blown it up a little bit below so that you can see it better. So let's read through this second paragraph. Well, I still have the last line of the paragraph before. And for the same reason, it also had the name Jupiter and retained a form set apart. All right, so the first revolution, we get Saturn. But it's retaining the form of Jupiter. How do we know that? Because it's flipped over here. It's upside down and mirrored. And then we go down here to Mercury. All right. So we seem to have a second revolution there that's giving us Jupiter. And they designated the moon the third time a primary substance or an elementata was brought forth from the four elements with a more obscure mark, one they were accustomed to calling Mercury. That's the bottom figure in the first row. You see how lunar it is. Lunar because it's got right the top of the moon there. Some wise ones wish that it be permitted for this to be produced by the fourth revolution. That will not at least be contrary to our secret proposition, so long as the purest magical spirit will superintend the work of the whitening in the place of the moon, and by means of spiritual virtue itself, it may without words speak hieroglyphically alone. The whitening, by the way, was translated in the C.H. Austin's 1964 translation, his albification, which is a stage in physical alchemy, because of his focus on physical alchemy. But it sounds like the language of physical alchemy here. The purest magical spirit will superintend the work of the whitening. That's the stage in physical alchemy where you're literally whitening out a substance that has been kind of corroded. You're getting rid of the dross and so on. All right. I mean, it may without words speak hieroglyphically alone with us through nearly the middle of our natural day. Well, Mercury, if I refer that to a week, it'll give us the middle of the week, but we also have magical hours. And those of you that know Agrippan correspondences can have fun with this one. But introducing and imprinting into the most pure and simple earth that which we have prepared, those four geogamic figures. Geogamic, that's Gamos Gaian or Gamaeaa, that unusual word that he uses and defines in his letter to Maximillian. I have a whole separate video on it below in my wordplay series. So we're going to come back to that because he's talking about making magical seals. Alchemically, though, since I noticed the language of alchemy here, alchemically, Saturn is associated with lead. The moon is associated with silver, the sun with gold, Jupiter to tin, which you can use to galvanize things like coating iron objects to keep them from corroding. It, by the way, tin is literally white lead in Latin. The Romans used it to make coins and mirrors, which somewhat explains this mirrored image of Jupiter, right? It's flipped and mirrored. So we still haven't answered what is the fourth revolution and how that relates to the secret proposition. Now, I've separated into the next video most of what he's doing here with long world ages, but since he has all of these different symbols for Mercury and is associating them with revolution, I'm going to also have to say some about it here. So if you don't know what long world ages are, I'm going to talk about that in just a couple more slides, but bear with me while we look at his secret proposition. Now, in the very last theorem, he had a secret proportion, which was referred to the vesica piscis or to dot, and it's in giving birth to the cosmos. So that word, the word that we translate as proportion, can also sometimes mean things like a ratio, a portion, two things that are symmetric in mathematics. It can be an analogy. It can even be a portal. The secret proposition, propositio rather than portio, it's a different word, but has a very different connotation here. It's like a proposition then also carries the idea of a declaration or a doctrine. And what is the most prevalent doctrine among educated humanists in Dee's age? Christian doctrine, of course. So because of us being in Theorem 12 and 12 being easily associated with temporal measurements, his discussion of revolutions makes us think about a secret doctrine of time, maybe, perhaps of long world ages. That was something people were very, very interested in Dee's time. That was the age of Nostradamus, after all. In fact, Dee had in his library a couple works of them. Prophecy and the prediction of long world ages. Doesn't sound very mathematical? Well, bear with me. He's going to try to make it mathematical, though I tend to agree with you in this case, it's not. But let's look at what he does and understand what he's doing. The sun and the moon are how we measure time, of course, whether we're talking about days, months, years. And so what the sun and moon do in the sky always affects us. They do it via revolutions of one thing around another thing. Whether you're looking at things as heliocentric or geocentric, they're still revolving. Longer world ages will often use planetary cycles as measurement. More about that in the next video, but just keep that in mind. When we talk about precessional astronomy, we're talking about the astrology and the astronomy of long world ages. So the way you would measure it, well, they know, as I've already mentioned in Dee's time, 72 is significant as the number of the Shemham Foresh, but also because if you are following the North Star Polaris, you know that in 72 years it will precess 1 degree. So we just multiply 360 by 72 and we have what one great year is. Well, that's what we do now. And since they knew 72 was associated with 1 degree of change in Dee's time, they could do that then also. But there's a problem because there were all, that would be in some circles blasphemous. Because if you're a Christian interested in literal biblical interpretation, you don't think that the world is going to last that much longer. 360 times 72 gives you over 25,000. I mean, that's what we know a great year would be today. And they could have done it then and certainly did because the math is pretty darn simple. But let's figure that we're not going to be dealing with 25,000 years because that's just too dangerous a thing to do in the bloody age that Dee is living in. So we're going to try for metaphor. Where will we look for that? Well, when we talked about his library, we learned that the first books he had from when he was an undergrad at Cambridge and then he kept accumulating them were Greek and Latin texts. And so if we look in those texts for discussions of great world ages, they're easy to find because in both Greek and Roman mythology, both cultures have stories where they start with the golden age. Can he equate that to Genesis? Well, sure, that sounds very much like the Garden of Eden, if you're treating all of these as parallel metaphors, which is what I'm doing now. So in Hesiod's epic Work and Days, the Muses tell him, and here's a picture from Moreau in 1891 of one of the Muses coming down and telling Hesiod about this, that one of the Titans, Kronos, who becomes Saturn for the Romans, that Kronos forms humans. And the humans live like gods. They never work, they never suffer, they're never sad, they live in this endless spring. They seem to age backwards. I mean, they have this joyful, carefree existence. And that's the golden age. It's spring. Oh, and is spring a metaphor for a long age? It is here, but of note in the hieroglyphic monad, we were at Aries of Aries. We're at the beginning of spring. So when Zeus, who's the king of the gods and becomes the Roman Jupiter, overcomes the Titans and makes himself ruler, the golden age ends and the silver age begins. You have a very famous work in Latin, a Roman work, Ovid's Metamorphosis, that also portrays great world ages that alchemically change from one to another, from gold to silver to bronze to iron. This down here is just eye candy. That's in the lower corner there, the ruins of the Temple of Saturn, which are the 8 columns to the far right, and the Arch of Septimius Severus. So Hesiod has 5 ages, Ovid has 4. There's a whole discussion, we'll have of that in the next video. If we take Dee's revolutions as an age, it would seem he'd have 4 ages. Now, there are some problems that you can see at a superficial glance immediately. So if Saturn is ruling the golden age, but Saturn is associated with lead, and a physical alchemist is trying to change lead into gold, how does that happen? Or do you just, after you get back to the age of iron, there's no age of lead, by the way, do you then suddenly go back to the golden age? Well, if you do that, that would imply a cyclical idea of time, which is exactly what you have in the Timaeus. Timaeus says that we don't know when all the cycles line up, but they eventually do. It's time as a cycle. That's actually a much more common way for humans to look at time, by the way. Remember back when the Mayan long count was going on and everyone was like, oh, the world is going to end because the Mayan calendar ends? Well, it ends and then it starts again. It's a cycle. Most calendars are cyclical. The world doesn't end on December 31st. It starts again in January 1st. But that doesn't fit well with overt Christian theology, where to many people, not all, but many, there is an end, and that end is the apocalypse, even though that's not what the Greek word it's derived from means. So we're going to explore this more. But first, let's ask, how would a Hermetic Christian reconcile this idea that long world ages deal with long cycles, just like a year deals with a short cycle? You probably guessed it. They are going to deal with it by having an apocalypse. So this creates the very strange situation in Dee's theorems that once time starts, he becomes very interested in how it will end. Okay, let's get it over with. How does this end? And apocalyptic thought, if you know the work of Dee, you know it dominates a lot of his later work, the Enochian work in particular. But it's a big theory, a big theme here too. With the Enochian work, I can't resist giving you the example of how there's much discussion in his spirit diaries about the apocalypse and the harrowing of people, and people who are, bad people are going to suffer and good people will be elevated. And Kelly has a vision, the vision of 4 watchtowers. Oh, like 4 ages, maybe so. And Dee lets him reform his whole great table of Earth based on the structure of part of the book of Revelation or the Apocalypse of St. John. So to Dee and a lot of very smart people in his age, a lot of humanists, the belief of an impending apocalypse, however you define what that word is, necessitates this calculation of great world ages. What age am I living in now, and how much time do I have until everything ends? I have to point out, though, the etymology of the word apocalypse. Why? Because I know Dee knew it. He was an expert in Greek, and we get this word from Greek. And it doesn't mean the world's going to end. Now, in Dee's time, to some people it did, but he also knew that the Greek word did not mean that. Apocalypsis comes from, you translated his revelation, but it literally means the uncovering. That's when everything that is hidden becomes visible because you've pulled off the covering. Now it is used in ancient Greek texts to talk about revelation, that is direct revelation from the gods or goddesses, or in the case of Hesiod, the muse that tells him this story. But the modern use of it to mean a catastrophe or the end of the world basically comes from the depiction of these events in the biblical book of Revelation, which is also called the Apocalypse. That is the revelation, because they would be synonym terms in ancient Greeks who were not Christian, right? Apocalypse and revelation are the same thing. It's an uncovering, a revelation. All right. Even now, where is he going to go with this? Well, by the time you get to Theorem 20, he'll have the 24 elders, 24, like the theorems, like hours in a day. The 24 elders or seniors, same word used for Enochian seniors later, by the way. He'll have them rotating in a circle around Jesus, and you'll get a picture of an implicit picturing of the golden age, and then you'll get some really fascinating geometric constructions around that, which I take as his breakthrough into accidentally constructing something that today we would call fourth dimensional, but we've got a long way to go to get there. Within the Rosicrucian movement that begins near the end of Dee's life, and which frequently uses his monad glyph, like in the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, among others, you get a lot of speculations about the construction of heavenly Jerusalem linked to prophecy. A famous example of this is Simon Studian's Neometria, the temple measurement. I tried to read it. My advice would just be don't. But the fact is that someone can dive into this subject and go into it for like 1,000 pages. Time becomes the agent of human alchemy. Alchemy works on time itself. That's the secret proposition. He's going to be talking about the alchemy of time, and he's going to be using geometric forms to do so. He will be talking about the structure of time and the end times. So that's the secret. So from here on, he is not, time has started, but he's not really interested in what happens tomorrow. He's interested in, are we done yet? Yes, I shamelessly took this from Ice Cube's movie of the same title. But when is it going to be over, and what's that going to look like? What will heavenly Jerusalem be like? The language of physical alchemy that you see in this theorem might invite you to think he's trying to transmute the fallen world in its worst form, the Iron Age, into the Golden Age, and that is what this drawing at the bottom is, that these symbols associated with planets will link to the 4 ages. There are some problems because you don't have the sun and the moon. The sun would be gold, right? The moon would be silver. But if you associate Saturn with the Golden Age, which is what did in Greece and Rome, and then go to Jupiter or Zeus, you'd have something like gold, tin. Oh, and then we'll get the moon, silver, and Mercury. Mercury is an age. That sounds interesting. I have a typo here, by the way. That word moon isn't supposed to be on my slide. Sorry about that, folks. I want to talk about this purest magical spirit. So long as the purest magical spirit will superintend the work of whitening in the place of the moon, which would normally do that. Silver would be associated with whitening. Okay. It actually sounds like a reference to the very common idea that in a fallen world, you need a pure spirit to do the great work. I've already talked about the common excuse of not being able to come up with a philosopher's stone. Like, my alchemist assistant isn't pure enough, and so their corrupted spirit just ruined the whole process. Okay, it sounds like that's what he's talking about, and he could be, but he's also saying where one does this process, this is spiritual alchemy. It's not physical alchemy. He's talking about Yesod, referred to the moon, the Sephira just before Malkuth, the physical world, the manifest creation. Now, when will it manifest? We'll see that in theorems 20 and 22. And to manifest before then, he says you need the purest magical spirit of the alchemist. But if you look at this grammatically, in Latin and in English, this can also be Mercury. Well, we know philosophical Mercury is supposed to allow someone to do the great transmutation that is supposedly the powder that years later Edward Kelly has that allows him to do that, right? Well, perhaps. Let's go on to the 4 geogamic figures. These are essentially magical seals, and he is going to say that they are made out of Mercury. All right, let's look at these. 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got Saturn, Jupiter, the moon, and an unusual form of Mercury. And he says they're geogamic figures. Remember what he said about that in the letter to Maximillian. Gamaeaa, he also said he used that in his aphorism to the Parisians, but those are lost. Gamos Gaian, you know Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage, right? Well, this is marriage of earth. What that essentially means is the idea of whatever celestial energy that you are collecting, you're charging this seal. So it's making magical seals. That's why they're earth of marriage. That's why they are, as he says in the letter to Maximillian, terrestrial seals of the conjugal influence. So these planetary symbols are now, he's corrected them and he's using them as magical seals. Now, there are a bunch of Mercuries. So how does this relate to which Mercury? Because we've got 3 of them, and then we've got the whole monad. So basically we've got 4 of them. Follow my little pointer here, and you will see there is this one in the bottom of the first column. That's the cross of elements and the moon. Then you have over here in the 4th column another one, which is the whole monad glyph except for Aries at the bottom. Then if you go straight down, you have this fifth hieroglyphic figure he's been talking about that is another symbol of Mercury. It's the first one, but now it has Aries at the bottom. So that gives us an idea, again, of physical alchemy and fire, but we suspect by now that he's being metaphoric about it. So if there is the purest magical spirit that to superintend the whitening, if there is fire. So how would that happen? How would you project that on the tree of life? In the theorem 13, not the next video, but the next theorem, we'll talk about these columns to the right that are created by signs of the sun. But if you go from back to the last theorem, the one where we saw the vesica piscis and dot, and if we assume D is partially referring to dot there, then what you're going to have is an image of Mercury projected onto the tree of life like this. Some of you have probably seen this before because, yes, this is one of the many things you have to memorize in certain initiatory societies. So this is, again, snagged from the public domain copy of Rigardi's 1937 text that I mentioned before, how interesting it is that some of the things in the knowledge lectures seem to exactly match the correspondences D is assuming you already know. Of course, a lot of that is also many people use magical correspondences, but not projecting Mercury onto the tree of life like this, and dot being in the monad the point that is punctured that creates the middle pillar. All right, well, so you have these symbols of Mercury. I've had to talk a little bit about world ages here because of Mercury being associated with them. But again, there's one symbol of Mercury. There's a second one. This one is essentially the same as the first one. And then you have a third one. And the symbol of the monad itself is a stylized glyph of Mercury. So you should now know how to make the symbols for the planets using the sun, moon, cross of elements, and sign for Aries, because D thinks he's corrected them, and that's the way you should do it. Next, we're going to go through the whole theorem again and see what long world ages he thinks we're going to be talking about, and we're going to use the work of the most famous and numerologically number-loving apocalyptic Christian you perhaps have ever met, Joachim of Fiore. So maybe we'll learn how to uncover the golden age, but if we don't, at least we'll see some cool eye candy like this graph. And just to give you a hint of where we're going, these 4 ages, do we see 4 here, or do we see 3, or 5? And yes, this is the Tetragrammaton. It's just written with Latin or Roman letters. Okay, that's where we're going next time. I'll see you then. Have a great day. Bye-bye.